Last night started out like any other Saturday. My wife Layla had plans to hit the club with her friends, something she did occasionally to blow off steam. I wasn't interested in joining her. I preferred a quiet night in after a long week at work. So I settled into bed early, looking forward to a good night's sleep. I woke up around midnight to a series of noises coming from the next room. Initially, it was just muffled voices and occasional bursts of laughter. I figured Layla had brought her friends back home for a nightcap, which wasn't entirely unusual. I rolled over, trying to ignore it, hoping they would keep it down and that I could get back to sleep. But the noises didn't stop. In fact, they seemed to grow louder and more distinct. I could hear Layla's voice, but it was different, breathless and strained. Concerned that she might be unwell, maybe too drunk, I decided to check on her. Annoyance fueled my steps as I marched towards the door. As I got closer, the nature of the sounds became clearer, and a cold dread settled over me. It wasn't just Layla's voice I heard. There was a man's voice, too, mingled with hers, and the unmistakable sounds of physical intimacy. My mind raced to find a rational explanation, clinging to the hope that I was mistaken. I hesitated for a moment, my hand on the doorknob, trying to steady my breath. The noises from the room, moans, whispers, and the creaking of the bed felt like a knife twisting in my gut. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, that it was just a bad dream, but deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. Finally, I pushed the door open, my eyes adjusting to the dim light of the room. The sight that greeted me is one I'll never forget. Layla was there, on top of a man I didn't recognize, both of them oblivious to the world around them. The scene hit me like a physical blow. My wife, the woman I loved, in our home, with another man. They were so engrossed in each other that they didn't notice me at first. I stood there frozen, my mind struggling to process the betrayal. The anger and hurt were overwhelming, a visceral reaction that left me momentarily paralyzed. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a wave of nausea. After what felt like an eternity, Layla looked up and saw me, her expression shifting from ecstasy to sheer horror. She scrambled off the man, who also turned to see me, his face pale with shock. The room went silent, except for the pounding of my heart. In that moment, everything changed. The life I thought I knew, the woman I thought I loved, all of it came crashing down in an instant. "What the hell, Layla?" I demanded, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. Layla scrambled to cover herself, her face flushed with panic. "It's not what it looks like. Camille," she stammered, her eyes wide with fear. "I can explain." The man she was with, tall, dark-haired, and clearly just as shocked, started to speak. "Look, man, I had no idea she was married. She told me she was single." "Get out of here!" I barked, pointing to the door. "Now." He hurriedly grabbed his clothes, muttering apologies as he dressed. "I'm really sorry, man. I didn't know. She's an unstable fool. I wouldn't have come here if I had known." Layla's face crumpled at his words, but she didn't try to stop him. He left quickly, casting one last glance of pity in my direction before disappearing out the door. As soon as he was gone, I turned back to Layla, my chest heaving with emotion. "What the hell were you thinking?" I shouted, my voice breaking. "How could you do this to us? To me?" Layla started to cry, her tears falling freely. "I'm so sorry, Camille. I don't know what came over me. It was a mistake, a terrible mistake." "A mistake?" I echoed, my voice cold. "You brought another man into our home, into our bed. How could you possibly think that was just a mistake?" She covered her face with her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. "I don't know, Camille. I've been feeling so lost and alone. I didn't know how to tell you." "Lost and alone?" I felt a bitter laugh escape my lips. "You should have talked to me, Layla. We're supposed to be partners. Instead, you did this." I turned away, unable to look at her anymore. The room was filled with the sound of her crying, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. The betrayal was too fresh, the pain too raw. "What happens now?" she asked through her tears, her voice barely above a whisper. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "I don't know, Layla. I don't know if I can ever forgive you for this." She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. "Please, Camille, don't leave me. We can work through this. I'll do anything." I shook my head, feeling the weight of the world on my shoulders. Right now I need some space. I need to think. Without another word, I walked out of the room, leaving her there with her guilt and shame. As I closed the door behind me, I felt the full impact of what had just happened. My world had been turned upside down, and I had no idea how to put the pieces back together. In the days that followed, I wrestled with the agony of betrayal and the confusing swirl of emotions. Layla begged for forgiveness, pleading with me to give our marriage another chance. Part of me wanted to walk away, to escape the pain and start anew. But another part, the part that remembered the love we once shared, hesitated. After countless sleepless nights and soul-searching conversations with friends and family, I made a decision. I told Layla I was willing to try, to give our relationship one last chance. The relief on her face was palpable, and she promised to do everything in her power to make amends. She even suggested we see a marriage counselor, a step I reluctantly agreed to. But despite our best efforts, the wounds were too fresh, too deep. Every time I looked at her, I was reminded of that night, of the betrayal that shattered my trust. Our conversations became stilted and awkward, filled with unspoken accusations and lingering resentment. The love that had once flowed so easily between us was now strained, like a fragile thread stretched to its breaking point. Layla tried to bridge the gap, but every attempt felt hollow and forced. I found myself withdrawing, unable to open up to her. The pain was too raw, and the anger simmered just beneath the surface, ready to erupt at any moment. I couldn't help but feel like a stranger in my own home, surrounded by memories that now felt tainted and false. To numb the pain, I turned to alcohol. It started innocently enough, a drink to help me sleep, to take the edge off the constant ache in my chest. But soon, one drink turned into several, and I found myself seeking solace in the bottom of a bottle more often than I cared to admit. The alcohol dulled the pain, made it easier to ignore the gaping hole in my heart, if only for a little while. Layla noticed, of course. She pleaded with me to stop, to find healthier ways to cope with my feelings. But I couldn't bring myself to listen. The alcohol was a crutch, a way to escape the reality I couldn't bear to face. Our arguments became more frequent and heated, and the distance between us grew wider with each passing day. One night, after a particularly bitter fight, I stumbled out of the house and found myself at a nearby bar. I sat there for hours, drowning my sorrows in whiskey and trying to forget the mess my life had become. As I stared at my reflection in the bar's mirror, I barely recognized the man looking back at me. I was lost, adrift in a sea of pain and regret, and I had no idea how to find my way back. The realization hit me hard. If I continued down this path, I would lose everything. I had to find a way to heal, to move forward, even if it meant facing the pain head-on. But I also knew that the journey ahead would be long and difficult, and I wasn't sure if Layla and I could weather the storm together. As I made my way back home that night, the weight of my decision pressed heavily on my shoulders. I had promised to give our marriage another chance, but I couldn't do it alone. Layla and I both had to fight for it, to rebuild the trust that had been shattered, and I had to find the strength to confront my demons, to face the pain and come out stronger on the other side. When I walked through the door, Layla was waiting for me, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. I took a deep breath and looked at her, finally ready to take the first step toward healing. "Layla," I said, my voice steady for the first time in weeks, "we need to talk. And this time, we need to be honest. No more hiding, no more running. If we're going to make this work, we have to face it all together." She nodded, tears streaming down her face, and reached for my hand. As we sat down to talk, I knew that the road ahead would be anything but easy. But for the first time since that fateful night, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. In the weeks that followed, I tried to rebuild the shattered pieces of our relationship. I attended the counseling sessions with Layla, participated in the exercises, and even made a conscious effort to be more present and engaged. But no matter how hard I tried, the memory of her betrayal lingered like a dark cloud over our every interaction. Layla, on the other hand, seemed to grow increasingly distant. She put on a facade of indifference, acting as though everything should return to normal now that I had agreed to give our marriage another chance. She seemed annoyed by my inability to move past her infidelity, as if my pain was an inconvenience she had to endure. One evening, during another strained conversation, I tried to express my feelings. "Layla, I'm struggling to trust you again. It's not something I can just switch off." She rolled her eyes, her voice tinged with irritation. I said I was sorry, How many times do I have to apologize? We should be moving on from this, not dwelling on it. Her dismissive attitude stung. It's not that simple. What you did, it's not something I can just forget. And you think it's easy for me? She snapped back. I've been trying to make things right, but you're the one who keeps dragging us back. Our arguments became more frequent and intense. Layla's frustration with me grew palpable, and she started spending more time out of the house, often returning late at night. Her behavior only heightened my suspicions and deepened my sense of betrayal. One night, she came home particularly late, stumbling through the door with a noticeable slur in her speech. The smell of alcohol was strong, and her clothes were disheveled. She barely acknowledged me as she made her way to the bedroom. "Layla," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Where have you been?" She turned to face me, her eyes glassy and unfocused. "Out with friends. Why do you care?" "Because I'm your husband, and I'm trying to make this work," I replied, frustration seeping into my tone. "But you're not making it easy." "Maybe you should stop trying so hard," she muttered, collapsing onto the bed without another word. As I stood there, watching her drift into a drunken sleep, a gnawing suspicion took root in my mind. Her late nights, her coldness, her dismissive attitude. Was she seeing someone else again? The thought made my stomach churn. I needed to know the truth, to confirm whether my worst fears were once again being realized. I decided to find out. I couldn't endure another cycle of betrayal and deceit. As I looked down at Layla, I knew that the coming days would bring answers, no matter how painful they might be. The gnawing suspicion that Layla was betraying me again gnawed at me relentlessly. I couldn't bear the thought of living in uncertainty, so I decided to take drastic measures to uncover the truth. I devised a plan to recreate the circumstances of the night I first caught her cheating. On the evening, she was supposed to go out with her friends again. I told her I had a business trip and would be gone for the night. Layla seemed indifferent, barely acknowledging my departure as she got ready to leave. I packed a small bag, making a show of heading out the door, but as soon as I was out of sight, I doubled back and quietly re-entered the house. I found a good hiding spot where I could watch the front door without being seen. Hours passed, and I waited in the dark, my heart pounding with anxiety and anger. Eventually, I heard the unmistakable sound of the front door opening. Peeking out from my hiding spot, I saw Layla stumbling in, clearly drunk, and she wasn't alone. The same man from that fateful night was with her, his arm wrapped around her waist as they laughed and whispered to each other. Rage boiled within me, but I forced myself to stay hidden a little longer. They made their way to the bedroom, the same place where I had caught them before. I followed quietly, waiting for the perfect moment to confront them. As soon as they were in the room, I stormed in, my fury barely contained. Layla's eyes widened in shock when she saw me.
"Camille, what are you doing here?"
Ignoring her, I turned to the man. "Get out," I snarled. He tried to stammer an apology, but I cut him off with a punch that sent him sprawling to the floor. "You knew she was married this time," I shouted, kicking him as he tried to scramble to his feet. "You have no excuse." The man didn't put up much of a fight. He grabbed his clothes and fled, bloodied and bruised. I slammed the door behind him and turned to Layla, who was slumped on the bed, too drunk to stand. "Is this how you're trying to save our marriage?" I demanded, my voice shaking with a mix of fury and heartbreak. Layla laughed bitterly, her words slurred.
"Oh my God, you've become so boring and uninteresting. I only cheated on you once, and you made such a tragedy out of it. You should have just accepted it and we would have been fine, but you kept whining like a wimp. I need a real man, not someone like you."
Her words cut deeper than any wound. I grabbed her by the arm and yanked her to her feet. "Get out," I said coldly. "Get out and don't come back. I'm filing for divorce." Layla stumbled towards the door, barely able to keep her balance. I opened it and shoved her out, her protests falling on deaf ears. As I watched her stagger away, a mix of relief and sorrow washed over me. It was over. The nightmare of our broken marriage was finally ending. I closed the door behind her and took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the world lift from my shoulders. I knew the road ahead would be difficult, but at least I was free from the lies and betrayal that had poisoned my life. It was time to start anew, to rebuild myself from the ground up. The morning after I kicked Layla out, I woke up with a mix of emotions. There was a lingering sadness, but also a sense of liberation. I had taken the first step toward reclaiming my life, but the journey was far from over. Later that day, there was a knock at the door. I peered through the peephole and saw Layla standing there, looking disheveled and contrite. I opened the door, but only a crack.
Camille, please. We need to talk. It was the alcohol. I didn't mean what I said. We can work this out.
I shook my head. Layla, I don't want to hear it. You made your choices, and now you have to live with the consequences. I shut the door in her face, her pleas muffled by the thick wood. Over the next few days, Layla kept coming back, begging for another chance. Each time, I refused to listen, shutting her out before she could even start. The sight of her, the sound of her voice, it all brought back the pain and betrayal too vividly. Determined to protect myself and secure a better position in court for the upcoming divorce, I decided to talk to Layla's friends, the ones she claimed to have been with the night she first cheated. I needed to understand her actions better and gather any information that could be useful. I reached out to a few of her closest friends, arranging to meet them individually. To my relief, most of them were sympathetic and didn't condone her actions. They were honest about what they knew, and their revelations were both shocking and heartbreaking. One friend, Anna, recounted the events of that night in detail. Layla was flirting with that guy all evening, she said. We tried to stop her, but she wouldn't listen. She was determined to go home with him. Another friend, Maria, told me something that cut even deeper. Camille, this wasn't the first time. She cheated on you a couple of years ago. She made us promise not to tell you, and she threatened to spread lies about us if we did. The weight of their words settled heavily on my shoulders. Layla had betrayed me not once, but twice, and had manipulated her friends into silence. It was clear that her actions were not just a one-time mistake, but a pattern of deceit and selfishness. Armed with this new information, I felt more confident about the impending legal battle. I knew I needed to protect my interests and ensure that the court saw the full picture of who Layla had become. Her friends' testimonies would be invaluable in showing that her infidelity and manipulation were long-standing issues. The next time Layla showed up at my door, I didn't even bother answering. I knew she had no intention of changing, and I couldn't allow myself to be drawn back into her web of lies. As I watched her walk away, I felt a sense of closure. The woman I once loved was gone, replaced by someone I no longer recognized. I was ready to move forward, to rebuild my life without her. It wouldn't be easy, but with the support of those around me and the truth finally out in the open, I knew I could face whatever challenges lay ahead. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, I felt hopeful. The weeks leading up to the divorce trial were some of the most intense and stressful of my life. I gathered all the evidence I could, preparing myself for the battle ahead. The information Layla's friends had provided was a crucial part of my case. Their willingness to testify about her infidelity and manipulation gave me a solid foundation to stand on. Finally, the day of the trial arrived. I walked into the courtroom with a sense of determination, knowing that I had done everything possible to protect myself. Layla sat across from me, her face a mixture of defiance and desperation. As the proceedings began, both of our lawyers presented our cases. My attorney meticulously laid out the timeline of events, backed by the testimonies of Layla's friends and the evidence of her repeated infidelities. Layla's lawyer tried to paint a different picture, portraying her as a remorseful wife who had made a single mistake. But the weight of the evidence was too strong to ignore. The judge listened carefully, weighing every piece of information presented. After what felt like an eternity, the judge finally delivered the verdict. Given the evidence of repeated infidelity and the testimonies provided, I find in favor of the plaintiff. Mr. Camille will retain the majority of the marital assets, and Mrs. Layla will receive a minimal settlement. Layla's face contorted with rage. She stood up abruptly, her voice shaking with fury.
I hate you, Camille. You've ruined my life.
I stood my ground, looking her straight in the eyes. No, Layla, you ruined your own life. You're the worst person I've ever met. You betrayed me, manipulated your friends, and lied to everyone around you. This is your doing. She glared at me, tears of anger and frustration streaming down her face. Without another word, she stormed out of the courtroom, leaving me standing there, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. She glared at me, tears of anger and frustration streaming down her face. Without another word, she stormed out of the courtroom, leaving me standing there, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. As I walked out of the courthouse, I felt a strange sense of peace. The chapter of my life with Layla was finally closed. and I could now look forward to rebuilding my future. It wouldn't be easy, and the scars of her betrayal would take time to heal, but I was free from the toxic relationship that had caused me so much pain. With each step I took, I felt lighter, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from my shoulders. The road ahead was uncertain, but I was ready to face it, stronger and wiser from the experience. It was time to start anew, to rediscover who I was without the weight of Layla's deceit holding me back. For the first time in a long while, I felt hopeful about the future, and that was a feeling worth holding on to.